Thank you so much. So next we have Jim Stanford, who is an economist and the director of the Centre for Future Work in Vancouver. Jim is one of Canada's most widely recognized economic contributors. You can more likely than not turn on CBC and hear Jim's commentary. So he has insights into everything from U.S. trade relations to enrollment trends, and he's previously served for over 20 years as the economist and director of policy for Unifor. So Jim has a number of recent and highly relevant publications related to the topic of our workshop today that he will be sharing more about. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you very much, Megan and Bill and your teams for having me, but mostly for pulling this group together and for pushing the envelope in all the ways that you're doing at this moment. That's obviously a challenging moment for all of us. I regret having spent New Year's Eve with some friends and said, you know, I'm cautiously optimistic that 2026 is going to be a better year. And I'm pretty sure I cursed it right then and there, because of course it's been all downhill already. And the problem with New Year's is a year is a year long. So then the question is, what other shit's going to hit the fan before we get there? So anyways, we're all feeling that and all feeling the urgency of what we do. And I thank you all for your courage and stick-to-itiveness as we move forward. Megan asked me to talk about the Jobs for Today report that I worked on that was published last year. And Megan, I will mention that report in the course of my presentation. But I'm going to try and put it in a much bigger context, I think, about how labor markets work and how the narrative about labor transitions needs to be improved and strengthened if we're going to win these debates. So I'll go through kind of three broad areas. I'll talk about the scale of the challenge of employment transitions related to the energy transition. Secondly, I'll get a little bit into some of the dynamics about how labor markets work and how they evolve and how they change, because I think that there's a lot of kind of superficialness about how the transition is going to occur and how we connect two dots, one dot being the jobs today in fossil fuels, the other dot being the jobs tomorrow in renewable energy. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that, and it's actually in a way easier than that if we understand how labor markets actually function. And then I will talk about the job opportunities presented by the energy transition, including what we estimated through that Jobs for Today report. So in terms of the dimensions of the transition in labor markets that is required, I think it's important for us to be able to push back very, very firmly at the propaganda we get from vested interests in the fossil fuel sector and their apologists in various parts of the world. Canada is not highly dependent on fossil fuel employment. That's just the reality. If you actually add up who's working directly in fossil fuel production, processing, transportation, it's a tiny share of the overall labor market and a falling share, a shrinking share of the overall labor market. Our most recent inventory, this is from some work that we did at our Centre for Future Work, 178,000 direct payroll jobs. That means people who are earning a wage or salary, employees, which was under 1% of total payroll employment in 2024. If we included self-employment, then the employment share is even smaller because there's very little self-employment in the fossil fuel industry, given how large and capital-intensive most of the operations are. Moreover, over the previous decade, that total of direct payroll work in fossil fuels declined by 38,000 jobs. So guess what? There's a transition happening, right? This isn't a hypothetical future. This is what's happening right here and now. And guess what? It's not happening because of climate policy, because I don't know if you've noticed, we're producing more of these things, not less of these things. Yet we're throwing tens of thousands of fossil fuel workers out of their jobs. And I think this is a very important wedge for us to counter the false jobs versus the environment choice that we're presented with over and over again. So this is the breakdown of direct fossil fuel employment in Canada into 7 broad categories. In total, 177,000 jobs, or less than 1% of total employment. Significant decline over the previous 10 years, and a significant decline in the share of total employment in those sectors. So if you chart the share, this is a payroll employment share in those 7 different categories of direct fossil fuel work, It's been falling since the peak of the oil sands boom in Alberta in 2014. All kinds of things have happened since then, of course, starting with the oil price crash in 2014. But that pace of decline from 1.4% to under 1% in 10 years, if you extrapolate that, you get to zero by 2050. There's a handy, convenient coincidence. It is a coincidence. It's purely a coincidence. But the reality is we're phasing out fossil fuel work as a share of our total labor market at a pace consistent with complete transition by 2050, which is our deadline for net zero status. So this is where the point being, the transition is already happening. Don't blame climate policy, blame the bosses in the fossil fuel industry who have laid off 40,000 people without any kind of transition plan, without any kind of supports other than what you get through your basic EI and other measures that are there. And again, this has happened despite significant and steady increases in fossil fuel production. And of course, we're now in a moment where the oil and gas industry is drooling at the prospect of pushing both of these lines up substantially more in the years to come. So another wedge for us, don't think that the employment problems faced in Alberta or any other fossil fuel dependent part of Canada are going to be solved by increasing oil and gas production. That's been happening for the last decade, and employment has been falling. And what's more, it's a case study in how not to do transition. It's actually quite consistent with how Canada's managed its boom and bust in resource employment since before Confederation. We've had wave after wave after wave of resource-oriented staples production, always around extraction and export rather than value-adding and diversification. And we're doing it again. And the lesson here is similar to the lesson we should have learned from the codfish collapse or the challenges in the BC forestry sector or the decline in manufacturing in Ontario in the 2000s or any number of other transitions, so-called transitions, where it was left to the market and the decisions, the employment decisions of private firms to decide who works when and when we toss those workers aside because they're no longer profitable. So here again, I think it's important for us to, none of us in this room want to be positioned as enemies of fossil fuel workers and their job security, but take this as a pedagogical moment to say, how come the labor market in Alberta and other resource communities is so weak? It's not climate policy. Take a look at your boss. And there's a lot of, I think, inherent understanding of that among fossil fuel workers based on research that we have done. Let's talk a bit about how labor markets adjust and evolve over time. And here I am going to talk about a report that we published late last year that Megan helped us launch. Thank you again, Megan, for that, where we interviewed and surveyed fossil fuel workers in different segments of the industry about how they view their future employment security and what sorts of futures they would like to see for themselves, including what sort of transition supports they'd be interested in. And a key point of this report is to highlight how labor markets change. And I think there's an understandable knee-jerk tendency among those of us advocating for a fast and ambitious energy transition to say, look at all the jobs here on the renewable energy side or the energy conservation side or the sustainable transportation infrastructure side. Let's just move those fossil fuel workers over into those jobs. And those new jobs will play an important role. But particularly when you're looking 25 years down the line, which is the transition that we would like to see and like to stick to if we could, that isn't how most of the evolution and most of the change is going to occur, by taking someone from working in the oil sands in Fort McMurray and putting them in a factory assembling windmill turbines. There are going to be jobs assembling windmill turbines as long as we, get ambitious about building that industry in Canada, but it isn't likely going to be filled by people who left fossil fuel jobs for all kinds of reasons. Training obviously is one of them. Geography is another one of them. Lack of interest is one of them. Why on earth should we assume that a fossil fuel worker today really, really, really wants to build windmills? There are things that fossil fuel workers might consider as alternative careers, but most of them have nothing to do with renewable energy. Most of them have to do with the jobs that they see as feasible given their lives and their skill sets and their interests. So understanding that the whole labor market is very much like a duck paddling on the water. It looks calm on top with little incremental changes in employment from one month to another that get the headline in the Statistics Canada release, but is paddling like crazy underneath. And the amount of change and flux and churn that occurs in Canada's labor market is frankly astounding. 6% of workers change their employment status every month. You never hear that in the news report. What you hear in the news report is employment rose 15,000 jobs. Not a bad month. That 15,000 jobs is less than 0.1% of total employment. But behind that net change in overall employment were these enormous changes of jobs disappearing, jobs being created, people moving from one job to another, people moving from one employment status to another. And when we understand how complicated and dynamic a labor market can be, in a way it makes our job easier, particularly if we can take advantage of the 25-year timeline that we imagine this transition taking. So that report highlights many of the dimensions of that dynamism and points out that given all that sort of change, shifting 1%, under 1% of our total employment from one industry to any number of other industries over a 25-year period is an absolute non-event. You absolutely won't be able to detect that change in the overall labor market statistics. And the political potency that this challenge of transition has been granted is so unbecoming of the economic reality that those workers face, or any workers in Canada face, because we have employment transitions happening all the time. Not just in resource industries. Think about Blockbuster video stores and all the other transitions that have occurred. And there was never any big political kerfuffle about how this was going to be handled because there was no enormous, concentrated, profit-hungry, vested interest in the middle of those debates. But that's what we confront in the case of the oil industry. The key takeaway on the transition here for fossil fuel workers is most of these workers will retire over the course of the next 25 years. And that is the easiest transition at the individual level that you can imagine. Finish your career and retire. That's your transition. And maybe we'll throw in some incentives to retire early or to retire better. But most fossil fuel workers can do that. What's essential is that you've got a timeline and a plan within which those retirements are contributing to an end goal, which is phase out by 2050, rather than saying this is a temporary vacancy, now we're going to hire someone else to come and fill the role. If you then hire someone else to backfill the role, then you've made the problem worse, because now you've got a young person who's starting their career in an industry that's going to die, and you've tricked them into investing their life in an industry that doesn't have that future. I've emphasized the point that there's all kinds of other industries where workers can be employed. Remember, most of the fossil fuel workers can retire before 2050, so re-employment isn't even on the table for that. But for the minority who won't, there's all kinds of options in other sectors. And the research that we did highlighted the flexibility of workers in being interested in working in a number of different sectors, including other resource industries other than fossil fuels, construction, transportation, manufacturing, technical services. Little known fun fact, over half of direct fossil fuel workers in Canada work and live in big cities. They're not the roughneck out in northeast BC somewhere. They're the computer technician or the geophysicist working in an office in downtown Calgary or downtown Vancouver. And for them, the transitions are going to be especially easy because there's so many other types of jobs that they can do in those cities and that their skills are going to be welcomed for. So think about it this way. Fossil fuel direct jobs make up under 1% of total employment. Renewable energy jobs and all the jobs associated with the energy transition will be more than that, okay? For sure. They will definitely be more. There will be a net employment gain, and I'll list a few of the studies that confirm this. But it's still going to be a tiny share of the overall labor market. Let's say 1.5%, maybe a 50% net employment gain by shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But why would we pay all of the attention to that when, in fact, there's another 97.5% of the labor market out there that people could conceivably work in? Now, fossil fuel workers aren't interested in all of those other 97.5% for various reasons, not least being the shitty quality of many of those jobs. Shitty job, by the way, is a technical term in economics. I should define it, Megan, as I go along. A job insufficient to meet the necessities of life, okay? But there's a lot of jobs out there they are interested in. So from that perspective, this is an absolutely manageable challenge for economic policy, including macroeconomic policy. The best way to make these transitions easy is to run an economy hot with the labor market pushing at the seams. And in that situation, people innately understand that there's lots of other opportunities out there, and they become less worried about losing their own job and more interested in what else is out there. And so the macroeconomic dimension is important. If, assuming that, something between a half and 2/3 of fossil fuel workers retire before 2050, that leaves something like 3,000 jobs a year that have to actually be transitioned to other forms of work. And you could give each one of those people an enormous package for retraining, relocation, start a small business, early retirement, whatever, and give them choice and give them flexibility, but most important, give them notice, give them certainty. This is exactly what Dan was saying. Give them certainty that this is going to happen. You can't deny that it's going to happen. In fact, most fossil fuel workers don't deny that it's going to happen. Let me sum up by, first of all, mentioning jobs for today, the thing I was invited to talk about, but more broadly, the whole issue about the alternative economic and employment opportunities in the energy transition. There's all kinds of studies out there about how many jobs are going to be created in renewable energy, energy conservation, building retrofits, sustainable transportation, public transportation, manufacturing the stuff for all of these things. So that is not the issue. It really is not the issue. And in fact, I'm getting bored of reading the studies saying that there's this how many great jobs are going to come out, because those studies are there and they're not helping us win the debate. And this is what we have to somehow figure out. I think Dan's hinted at several of the reasons there. Several economic reasons why there's so much work in the energy transition. It's a more labor-intensive activity. Fossil fuel production, oil and gas in particular, has hardly any labor input in it. So you can produce huge swaths of it and invest tens of billions of dollars in it and produce very little work. This is why fossil fuel work accounts for less than 1% of jobs, even though it accounts for a much larger share of GDP, which doesn't mean it's important. Okay, we could have a whole other section on what's wrong with those GDP numbers. But the capital intensity of the industry explains why it doesn't create much work. And by the way, there's going to be more capital if we do the energy transition right. There's going to be more investment in those, and even all of the oil sands expansion and pipelines that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers wants to produce, we could spend way more on renewable energy. And then we get much stronger domestic economic spin-offs from renewable energy or energy transition investments for all kinds of reasons, including the more intense labor utilization in the first place, but also the greater domestic content. The oil and gas sector generates very little spin-off activity into Canada's economy, in part because 80% of the value added in petroleum, 80%, goes to gross corporate profits, and most of the gross corporate profits are owned by foreign companies. So, again, don't be misled by a big GDP number. Let me just survey some of the research. I'm just going to list 4 reports that I was personally involved in. Therefore, I know about them, but literally there's dozens of others. This is the Jobs for Today report from the Centre for Civic Governance, formerly the Columbia Institute, partnering with the Canadian Building Trades Unions, the CBTU, which is not a tree-hugging group, believe me, but they are very interested in this. So we analyzed the job content of big investments over 25 years in 3 buckets of energy transition work. Obviously generating and transmitting renewable energy, energy conservation, particularly in the building side, commercial and institutional buildings, and then sustainable energy transportation infrastructure. Huge amounts of construction work. We were only measuring the construction jobs, that's it. Between 250,000 and 330,000 jobs on average over the next 25 years. That's a 20% step increase in total construction employment in Canada. Enormous work for building trades if we did this right. Another report that I contributed to with some ancillary analysis and comment was from the David Suzuki Foundation, looking at the job benefits of an ambitious clean electricity and electrification strategy. This was published in 2022, Shifting Power. 80,000 net jobs in just the electrification end of it. Another report that I contributed to was from the C40 Cities Initiative. This is the thing that David Miller, the former mayor of Toronto, has been helping lead globally. But they did a study in Canada just focused on urban investments in the larger cities around, same deal, renewable energy, energy modernization, public transportation, energy efficiency. 200,000 to 300,000 net jobs in Canada from that program of investment, depending on how ambitious the investments were. Another project that I reviewed, I wasn't a co-author on, was from the CCPA, Mark Lee and Seth Klein, published in 2020, focused on BC. So this is relevant here. What would happen if BC tried to meet the Stern Report's guideline of allocating 2% of GDP over a 25-year period to the energy transition? And their estimate was 42,000 net jobs, direct and indirect, just in BC from that. So really, there's no argument whatsoever that these huge investments, if we went ahead with them, would create enormous amounts of work. But despite that evidence, we're still getting rolled back on the jobs front with the heightened insecurity that people feel because of Donald Trump. The power of the fossil fuel industry to play that card has been enhanced, and I think we all understand that and we all see that. I'm trying to scratch my head. Why? Why are people so excited about a pipeline and not excited about another job, say an east-west transmission grid, that would produce at least as many jobs as a pipeline in the near term for construction, and more spin-off and indirect benefits as well. I think somehow people aren't believing that those investments are going to occur, but they do believe that the pipeline would get built. That's a stretch too, frankly, but they do believe that the oil companies, if they really want it, would do it, and then they would hire us again. So somehow we have to make that concrete and win the confidence that the plan is going to happen. And again, this echoes what Dan was just saying. We need a credible commitment to a long-term plan. It's easy peasy, the transition, if there was that long-term plan, and there's lots of international and Canadian examples of how that can happen, and give people real voice, real security, real bargaining power, so that it's not just an abstract idea, but they can actually sense the money and the jobs and the opportunity as they see this energy transition happening. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Al.